The sun had no mercy out here. It never did. Out on the Arizona plains, the heat pressed down like a hand on your chest, dry and unrelenting, baking the cracked earth until it split open like old leather. The sky was so wide and so blue, almost hurt to look at, stretching in every direction without a single cloud to offer mercy. The land was ancient here, silent. The kind of silence that gets inside a man and reminds him just how small he really is. And riding through all of it, slow and steady, was a man named Caleb. Caleb wasn't the kind of man who invited conversation. He was broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with hands that had been roughened by years of rope and rock and relentless desert wind. He didn't talk much. I didn't need to. Out on the plains, words had a way of disappearing into the air before they reached anyone worth hearing them. So Caleb had learned to live without them. He rode his horse, a steady brown mare named Dust, along the edge of the riverbank each morning, scanning the horizon out of habit more than hope. There was never anything out there, until the morning there was. He almost missed her. She was so small, so still against the vastness of the landscape, that his eyes passed over her once before snapping back. A little girl, no older than 6, maybe 7, standing near the water's edge with her arms wrapped around herself, her tiny body trembling in the heat. Her clothes were torn and hanging loose, dusty and faded. Her hair was matted, tangled with red clay and desert grit. And her feet, those bare little feet, were pressed against the cracked earth like she'd been standing there for a long, long time. Caleb pulled Dust to a stop. His heart did something he hadn't felt in years. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements soft. He'd seen wild animals startled before, and something in the way this child held herself told him she wasn't far off from that. She was ready to run. Every part of her was coiled with the kind of fear that doesn't come from one bad moment, but from a long string of them. "Hey there, little one," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. She flinched, a sharp, full-body flinch like she'd been struck. But she didn't run. She just stared at him, her dark eyes wide and glassy, searching his face for something she wasn't sure she'd find. Oh, those eyes. There was something in them that a child's eyes should never have. A heaviness, a wariness, so deep it sat behind her gaze like a stone at the bottom of a river. This little girl had seen something, been through something, and she was out here alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one and nothing around her but the river and the merciless Arizona sun. Caleb crouched down slowly, lowering himself to her level. He reached into his saddlebag without looking away from her, not wanting to break the fragile thread of trust that was forming between them. His fingers found what he was looking for. A small loaf of bread he'd packed that morning, and a water skin still half full. He set them both on the ground between them, gently, like an offering. "Eat," he said softly. Just that. One word. She stared at the bread. Her little fingers reached out slowly, hovering over the edge of the loaf like she was afraid it might disappear. Like good things always had before. And then, with a sound so quiet it nearly broke him, a small sniffle, just one, she picked it up and began to eat. Caleb sat down right there on the dry earth beside her. He didn't speak, didn't push. He just sat, close enough to be a presence, far enough not to crowd her. Above them, through the sparse and crooked branches of a lone mesquite tree, the sunlight fell in pieces across the ground. And for one moment, the whole wild world seemed to go still. He noticed a bracelet on her wrist. It was delicate, beautifully made. Thin strands of leather, braided with such care and patience that each twist was perfect. Set into the braid were small turquoise beads, the color of the sky after rain, each one catching the light in a way that made them look almost alive. It was not a simple ornament. It was a piece of who she was, a thread of heritage wound around a small, trembling wrist. Apache. Caleb recognized it. He'd spent enough years on these plains to understand what he was looking at. This child was not just lost. She was the daughter of a people who had lived and breathed and bled in this land for generations beyond counting. A proud and ancient people. And here she was, alone and frightened, on the edge of a river, with no one to call her name. He felt something settle in his chest, heavy and quiet, the weight of responsibility. He looked at her and asked, gentle as he could, "Where's your family, little one?" She shook her head, just once, and her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, tears that she held back with a strength that no child should have to use. And Caleb had to look away for a second because something was pressing hard behind his own eyes, and he wasn't about to let it out here on the open plains. But before we go any further, please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Because of this story, it deserves to travel. It deserves to reach every heart it can find. So Caleb stayed. He didn't think about it long, didn't weigh it out or reason through it the way practical men do. He just looked at that little girl eating bread beside the river, her shoulders slowly dropping away from her ears as the food reached her belly and the fear eased its grip just slightly. And he knew he couldn't leave her. The plains were no place for a child alone. The heat alone could take her before nightfall. And there were things out there, animals, whether desperate men, that didn't care how small or innocent you were. Caleb set up a modest camp beneath the mesquite tree, gathering what he had in his saddlebag to make her comfortable. A blanket, a second piece of bread, shade. The girl watched him work with those enormous, careful eyes. And then, so slowly it almost wasn't happening, she moved a little closer to him, just a few inches. But Caleb noticed, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for years, years of solitude and silence, and riding alone through the unforgiving desert, loosened just a little. By the time the sun began its long descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that looked like fire and sorrow mixed together, the girl had fallen asleep beside him, one small hand curled under her cheek, the turquoise bracelet catching the last of the golden light. Caleb sat beside her and watched the plains go dark. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel alone. But what happened next morning changed everything. Because someone was watching. Someone had been watching the whole time. And what they said to Caleb beside that river would bind him to this family for the rest of his life. Stay with me. The next morning came the way mornings always do in Arizona. Suddenly, blazing, like someone pulled back a curtain and set the whole world on fire. Caleb was already awake. He'd barely slept, keeping one ear open through the night, alert to every shift of the wind and every sound the darkness brought. The girl, curled beneath the blanket he'd laid out for her, hadn't stirred once. She slept the way exhausted children do, completely and desperately, like her body had just surrendered to rest after fighting it for too long. He watched her sleep and felt something unfamiliar move through him. Over the days that followed, a quiet rhythm emerged between them. Each morning Caleb would rise early, tend to dust, and prepare whatever food he had. The girl would wake slowly, always watching him first before she moved, as though confirming he was still real, still there. Each time she found him where she'd left him the night before, something in her face shifted, the tiniest softening around her eyes, the faintest release of breath that she'd been holding since before she could remember. She didn't speak much, but she began to follow him. Wherever he went, she was there. 3 steps behind, then 2, then 1, and finally just beside him, her small hand occasionally brushing his arm as if to remind herself he was solid. Real. Safe. He began to talk to her as he worked. Not about anything in particular. About dust, about the river, about the way the desert smelled before rain came. She listened to all of it with total attention, her dark eyes tracking him like he was telling her the most important thing she'd ever heard. On the 3rd day, she laughed. It was small, barely a sound at all. He'd been trying to teach her to whistle and had made a mess of it himself by accident, producing a wobbling, ridiculous noise that surprised even him. And she laughed, this quiet, musical little sound that was over almost before it began, and then she looked at him like she couldn't quite believe she'd done it. Caleb smiled. He couldn't help it. He hadn't smiled like that in a long time. But life on the plains does not give peace without a price. Even as these quiet days unfolded beside the riverbank, Caleb could feel something in the air, a tension in the distance, an awareness. He would catch glimpses, sometimes from the corner of his eye, A figure standing at the tree line. A shadow that moved when the wind didn't. Someone was watching. On the fifth morning, they came. Caleb was by the water, filling the canteen, when he heard the girl make a sound behind him. Not a cry, not a shout, a sound that held everything, relief and love and a desperate hope all pressed into one breath. He turned. At the edge of the riverbank stood a woman. She was tall, graceful in the way that real strength always is, not rigid, not hard, but steady and deeply rooted. She wore her dark hair loose, and it moved slightly in the morning breeze. Her eyes, when they found Caleb, were the most watchful eyes he had ever seen. Not cold, not hostile, but measuring, careful, carrying the weight of a mother who had spent 5 days not knowing if her child was alive. The little girl ran to her. She crossed the distance between them so fast her feet barely seemed to touch the ground. And when she reached her mother, she threw herself forward with such force that the woman staggered back a step, wrapping her arms around her daughter and pulling her in so tight that for a moment neither of them moved. The woman pressed her face into the child's hair and closed her eyes, and her breath came in one long, shaking exhale. Caleb looked away. He didn't belong at that moment. He busied himself with the canteen, giving them the space they needed, listening to the quiet sounds behind him without turning around. The soft voice of the mother murmuring to her daughter. The child's muffled response. The sound of arms that refused to let go. When he finally turned back, the woman was looking at him. She walked toward him slowly, measured and deliberate, and stopped a few feet away. She studied him for a long moment. His face, his hands, the modest camp he had made, the blanket still folded near the tree. And then she looked at her daughter, who had pressed herself against her mother's side, but was gazing up at Caleb with those wide, familiar eyes. The woman straightened. When she spoke, her voice was low and ceremonial, carrying a weight he felt in his bones. "You fed my daughter," she said. "You sheltered her. You kept her safe when the land would have taken her." She paused. "By ancestral tradition, you belong to our family now." The words fell over Caleb like cool water in the heat. He went very still. He understood, somewhere in a place where instinct lives deeper than thought, that she was not thanking him. Not exactly. This was something older, something binding. In her culture, the act he had performed did not simply earn gratitude. It created an obligation. Not servitude, not debt, but belonging. A tie between him and this family that her people would recognize and honor and expect to be honored in return. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, just once, slowly, the way a man nods when he understands that his life has just turned a corner it will never turn back from. The woman's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did. Something settled. She had been prepared, he realized, for him to refuse. Prepared for the awkward backtracking, the polite distance, the wall that most outsiders built when Apache tradition came too close. She had offered this sacred thing, knowing it might be rejected. And he had accepted it. Her name, he learned that same morning, was Ayanna. But accepting those words was only the beginning. Because there were people on the frontier who weren't ready to accept what was forming between Caleb, Ayanna, and that little girl. And what was coming from those people would test everything. Don't go anywhere. Her name meant eternal blossom in her language. Ayanna. Caleb said it a few times in his head before he said it aloud, wanting to give the word the weight it deserved. When he finally did say it, she looked at him with a small, approving nod, the way a teacher looks at a student who has just understood something important. The little girl's name was Chenoa. It meant white dove, and she was exactly that. In the days and weeks that followed, a life began to take shape around the three of them that none of them could have predicted or planned. Ayanna arrived each morning at dawn, and there was always something she brought with her. Not just knowledge, though there was plenty of that. She brought presence, a warmth that Caleb hadn't realized was missing from his days until it arrived and filled the space so completely it was impossible to imagine it gone again. She taught him things that no book and no rancher had ever thought to share. She showed him which desert plants could draw out a fever, pressing dried leaves between her palms and explaining in quiet, precise words what each one did and why. She taught him to track not just animals, but weather, reading the clouds and the way the grass bent, and the particular smell the wind carried before a storm. She knew this land the way you only know something you have loved for generations, not just with your mind, but with your whole body. Caleb learned to listen. That was its own kind of lesson. He had always been a man of action, of doing, learning to sit still and receive knowledge without rushing to apply it. To honor what was being shared by paying it full attention was harder than anything the desert had ever asked of him. But Ayanna waited. She was patient without being passive, and somehow her patience made him want to be worthy of it. In return, he shared what he knew. He taught her the rhythms of ranch work, the way to check a horse's hoof for stones, how to patch a fence post before a storm could bring it down. He showed her how to read the brands on cattle and the documents that passed between settlers, how to navigate the paper world that was slowly and relentlessly pushing itself across the land her people had held for centuries. She received these lessons with the same quiet attention she gave to everything, and Chenoa watched all of it. She sat between them at lessons, on the fence rail during ranch chores, at the fireside in the evenings. She absorbed both worlds simultaneously, the way only children can, slipping from one language to the other in a single sentence, laughing at Caleb's pronunciation and correcting him with the authority of someone 3 times her age. She was the brightest thing on the plains. Those evenings by the fire became the center of Caleb's days. The desert sky above them was enormous and absolutely clear, packed from edge to edge with stars that burned low and close in the thin air. Ayanna would sometimes point out constellations and tell him the stories her people attached to them, stories that were nothing like the ones he'd grown up hearing, but that somehow felt just as true. Chenoa would fall asleep between them, one hand curled around the edge of Caleb's vest. Every single time, without fail, that image reached into Caleb's chest and did something to him. But the world outside, their quiet riverbank life, was not so warm. Talk had started, the way talk always does in frontier towns, low and sideways, passing from porch to porch and ranch to ranch until it grew bigger than the truth that had started it. People were saying things. That Caleb had lost his mind, that he'd let the Apache get their hooks in him, that no decent man aligned himself with their kind. Their kind. He heard it at the supply store one Tuesday morning. Didn't mean to. 2 ranchers talking behind a stack of feed sacks, their voices carrying in that careless way of men who assume everyone around them agrees. Caleb stood very still. He thought about Chenoa running toward him across the field, her laughter scattered behind her like seeds. He thought about Ayanna standing beside him at the fence line the evening before, pointing at the horizon and telling him the name her grandmother had given to that particular shade of red in the sky. He thought about belonging to something for the first time in years. And he walked out of that store and didn't say a word to either of them. Not because he was afraid, because they weren't worth the breath. He rode back to the ranch in the white heat of the afternoon and found Ayanna teaching Chenoa to braid near the water's edge, both their heads bent over the rope between them, Chenoa's small fingers working the strands with enormous concentration. They looked up when he rode in. Chenoa dropped the rope immediately and came running. He lifted her onto the saddle in front of him, and she grabbed Dust's mane with both hands like she was born to it, laughing at the height. Ayanna watched him. She had learned to read his silences. People are talking, he said. People have always talked, she replied, without looking up from the braid in her hands. The land does not listen to them. Neither do I. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Neither do I, he said. That evening, one of the Apache elders came to the camp. An old man, weathered as driftwood, with eyes that had seen more decades than Caleb could guess. He stood at the edge of the firelight and studied Caleb for a long, unblinking moment. Then he said something to Ayanna in their language. She translated quietly. He says you have a good face, the kind that doesn't hide things. Caleb didn't know what to say to that. Tell him I'm trying, he managed. The old man listened to the translation. And then, for the first time, he smiled. But there was a moment coming. A moment that would force Caleb to choose between the easy life and the right one. Between walking away and standing firm. And what he chose in that moment would echo across that community for years. You don't want to miss it. There's a specific kind of beauty that belongs only to the desert at night. Caleb had lived on the plains long enough to know it, but it wasn't until this particular season of his life, that he truly felt it. Sitting outside the cabin after Chenoa had gone to sleep, with Ayana beside him and the fire burning low between them, the whole enormous dark sky pressing down close and warm, he understood for the first time what it meant to be somewhere. Not just physically, but entirely. The weeks had become months. The three of them had settled into something that had no real name in any language Caleb knew, but that was real and solid and present in the way only true things are. He woke each morning with purpose. He went to sleep each night with something quieter and deeper than contentment. He was happy. He hadn't known he was unhappy before. That's the thing about solitude when it goes on too long. It starts to feel like peace. It starts to feel like enough. And you forget, gradually, what it was like to have someone to share the weight with. Ayana had given him that back without ever making it feel like a debt. She arrived one morning with two of the women from her community, and there was something different in her face. Not troubled exactly, but alert, careful. She sent the women to sit with Chenoa and then walked to where Caleb was working at the fence line, stopping just beside him. "There is talk in the settlement," she said. "Not from our people, from theirs." He already knew what she meant. The pressure from the surrounding settlers had been building slowly, like weather you can smell before you can see it. There were men in the nearest town who had decided that the Apache families living near the river were too close, too settled, and there were enough of those men, and they were loud enough that their voices had started to carry weight with the local authorities. "They want the families to move," Ayana said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Caleb looked at her hands. She was gripping the fence rail, her knuckles pale against the dark wood, and she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the river. Her river. The water that her people had known before there were fences to grip. Something rose in Caleb that he hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Something deeper and colder and more decided than anger. "No," he said. "Just that. One word." Ayana looked at him. "They will come," she said. "Men from the town. Maybe with papers. Maybe with something worse." "Then they'll come," Caleb said. "And they'll find me here." He held her gaze. She searched his face for hesitation, for the small pullback that always came, the moment when men who meant well remembered what it cost to mean it in public. She had seen it before. She had learned to brace for it. She didn't find it. Her breath came out slow and long, and she looked back at the river, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, very quietly, "You understand what this could cost you?" "Yes," he said. He did understand. He understood that the people in town would stop merely whispering and start doing. That his own reputation, such as it was, would be used against him. That there would be visits. Pressure. Possibly worse. He thought about Chenoa asleep in the cabin. He thought about the first time she had laughed. He thought about the elder standing at the edge of the firelight, saying you have a good face. The kind that doesn't hide things. And he picked up his tools and kept working. The men came 3 days later. 4 of them, riding in the mid-afternoon with their hats pulled low and their expressions arranged into the kind of careful neutrality that always precedes something ugly. Caleb was in the yard when they arrived. He stood and waited. The one in front, a heavy-set man named Bert that Caleb had seen at the supply store, pulled his horse up short and looked around the property. His eyes landed on Ayana, standing near the cabin door, and Chenoa beside her. "Caleb," Bert said, by way of greeting. "Not friendly." "Bert," Caleb replied. "Want to talk to you about the situation here." "I can see that." Bert shifted in his saddle. His eyes kept moving back to Ayana and the girl. "This isn't right what you're doing. You understand that, don't you? The way it looks. The way people are talking. You've got a reputation to protect." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at Bert. He looked at the other 3 men, sitting back slightly, letting Bert carry the words, but ready to carry something else if necessary. He looked at Chenoa. She was watching from the cabin door, half behind her mother, her dark eyes moving carefully between the men and Caleb. She wasn't afraid of him. That was the thing. Even with 4 strange men on horses in the yard, she wasn't afraid of Caleb. She trusted him completely. "I'll tell you what I understand," Caleb said, his voice quiet and even. "I understand that I made a promise, and I understand that I'm keeping it, and I understand that what happens on my property is my business." He stepped forward. "One step. Enough. And I think you understand that you're done here." The silence stretched. Bert looked at him for a long moment, looked at the set of his shoulders and the steadiness of his eyes and the absence of any doubt in his face. Then Bert looked away first. "This isn't over," he said, as he turned his horse. "It is for today," Caleb replied. He watched them ride away until they were nothing but dust on the horizon. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin. Chenoa left the door at a run. She crossed the yard and hit him at full speed, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her face into his side, and he put his hand on the top of her head, gently, and stood there while she held on. Ayanna stood at the door, watching. There were no words exchanged between them. None were needed. And what happened after those men rode away, what the Apache community did, what Caleb received that he never expected, will stay with you long after this story ends. One more part. Stay with me. Word travels differently in Apache country. Not on paper, not through town gossip or the back and forth of supply store conversations. It travels the way the people themselves have always traveled, quietly, with purpose through the land itself. And so, by the time the sun rose the next morning, the story of what Caleb had done was already known. He didn't realize this until mid-morning, when he looked up from his work and found that he was not alone. There were people at the edge of his property, not threatening, not imposing, just there. 3 families, standing together, watching him with the same careful, measuring eyes he had come to recognize. He stood up slowly, not sure what he was seeing. Then the elder, that same driftwood-weathered old man who had visited the fire weeks ago, stepped forward. He spoke. Ayanna, standing beside Caleb, translated, but her voice was not quite steady. "He says that your actions have been seen, that you stood between his people and those who would move them from their land. He says this is not what outsiders do. He says you have earned a name." Caleb went very still. "What name?" he asked. Ayanna listened to the elder for a long moment. When she turned back, her eyes were bright. "He who stays," she said. Caleb looked at the ground for a moment. He pressed his lips together and looked at the ground, and breathed slowly, and did not trust himself to speak for a few seconds. "He who stays." In all his years on the plains, all the names and titles and descriptors that the frontier had given him, none of them had ever landed like this, because they were all about what he could do. This one was about who he was. The families who had come stayed for the rest of the day. They helped with the ranch work, moving through the chores with the easy efficiency of people accustomed to shared labor. The elder sat in the shade of the mesquite tree and watched everything with those ancient, knowing eyes. Women brought food and spread it out and called Caleb over to eat with them, and he sat among them feeling not like a guest, not like a curiosity, but like someone who was exactly where he was supposed to be. Chenoa was in her element. She ran between the groups of children and adults like a small, joyful thread pulling the whole thing together. She pulled Caleb by the hand to show him things, introduced him to people with the casual confidence of a child who has no doubt about her place in the world. She had no idea how recently that confidence had been absent, how short a time it had been since she had trembled on a riverbank, reaching for bread from a stranger's hands. That evening, when the families had gone and the fire was burning and Chenoa was asleep inside, Caleb sat beside Ayanna in their usual silence. After a while, she spoke. "You saved my daughter," she said. "You could have ridden in the past. Almost any man would have." "I don't know that," Caleb said. "I do," she replied. She was quiet for a moment more. "You fed her. You sheltered her. You carried her into a life that was safe and warm. And then when it cost you something real, you did not step back." He looked at the fire. "I couldn't," he said simply. "That," she said, "is why you have a name now. There is something that happens to a person when they are truly seen. When someone looks at them, not at what they've done or what they could offer or how they fit into a category, but at the actual interior thing, the self underneath the silence and the solitude and the years of going it alone, and says, 'Yes, I see you, and you're good.'" Caleb had not been seen that way in a very long time. He sat with it, the way you sit with something precious, carefully, without grabbing at it. The months that followed brought change that was slow and then suddenly fast, the way seasons change on the plains. The pressure from the settlers didn't vanish entirely, but it lost its momentum. Other ranchers, watching what Caleb had done, began to reconsider. A few came to him quietly, with questions rather than confrontation. He answered them honestly. Some listened, some didn't. But the community around the river held its ground, and the family stayed, and the children grew, and life went on. Caleb and Ayanna built something that resisted every word anyone tried to use to diminish it. It was not simple. Real things rarely are. There were hard conversations, misunderstandings, moments when two different worlds pressed against each other and neither knew how to give. There were days when the weight of the frontier, its cruelty and its prejudice, settled over everything like dust. But there was also this, Chinoa on horseback, calling back over her shoulder, fearless. Ayanna beside him in the evening light, pointing at the sky. The elder nodded slowly from across the fire. The name, he who stays. Caleb thought about the man he had been before, riding alone through the silence, the plains stretching empty in every direction. He had believed, in the uncomplicated way of isolated men, that this was simply who he was. Solitary, self-sufficient, untethered. He understood now that he had been waiting. Not for rescue, not for instruction, just for something worth staying for. He had found it on the edge of a river, in the form of a small girl with turquoise beads on her wrist and fear in her eyes, and every reason in the world to distrust the stranger crouching down in front of her. She had reached for the bread anyway, and he had stayed. That's the thing about kindness. The real, uncommon, deliberate kind. It doesn't just change the person you offer it to. It changes you. It reaches back through every lonely year and fills them with meaning. It makes the future different from the past. It makes you belong somewhere. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the stranger who stayed? Or the child who needed someone to? Have you ever had a moment where one choice, one small act of deciding to see someone rather than ride past, changed everything? Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Because out here on the plains, and in every city and town where people are quietly reaching for bread from the hands of strangers, this is what we need more of. Not heroes with weapons. People with bread. People who stay.